We are going to have a seminar on an issue which we all should think uh, of much contemporary relevance today. We are going to hear from Professor Krishna Jayakar, who is going to talk about his book, Making Policy for the New Information Economy. Uh, I'm not here to talk about the subject. I'm talk more about the author. That's my job, I suppose, is welcome, isn't it? That's right. And chair, right. Um, I'm more interested to talk about the speaker because he's an interesting person. Because I had a lunch with him. Uh, and originally an Indian bureaucrat working with the Ministry of Information Broadcasting. By accident, went for a training to US, and we lost and the US gained to some of the position. Today, he is the professor uh, and head of the Department of Telecommunications and Media Industries, Pennsylvania State University in the United States. He has done incredible amount of work. I was looking at his, I'm not going to introduce him. You have this for you to, Google is there, Google Scholar is there. The point is that what impressed me is he has consistently worked on an area of information telecom policy, which he started after his engineering graduation. And as you are aware, we are living in the world of fourth industrial revolution. And the problem was much more easily amenable for analysis and exploration during the first industrial revolution and second industrial revolution. And problem got complicated with the third industrial revolution. And today we are in the cusp of what is called industry 4.0, wherein we have a constellation of innovations. You have robotics, you have artificial intelligence, you have got blockchain and Internet of Things. All these makes visualizing the future incredibly difficult. And going by the available evidence, the information world is also characterized by so much of information asymmetry and power balance and monopolies, which, if not appropriately regulated, if we don't have an appropriate policy framework that co-evolves with innovations, we may not be able to take the best out of it. And this is here work of Professor Krishna Jayakar becomes important. And I'm very, very thankful to Professor Jayakar. And Professor Jayakar is actually visiting Digital University, and Dr. Pradeep is here. And you know that during our GlobalX International Conference, we had an opportunity to work with Digital University and Pradeep, and of course, their Vice Chancellor. They were very much supportive for the conference, and I consider this kind of inter-institutional collaborations are in any day mutually beneficial. And it is Digital University that facilitated visit of Professor Jayakar over here, and convey our appreciation to Professor Saji Gopinath for this. And I warmly welcome Professor Jayakar and also Professor Pradeep for this meeting. And I think any more talking from my will be an over talk, so I stop here. Over to you, Professor Jayakar.
Thank you very much, Professor Joseph. It's a wonderful honor to be present here, to look at this crowded room and see that I'm speaking at the Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation. Dr. Gulati, of course, is a person who is world-renowned and has done a lot of service for the state of Kerala. He came from outside and he has built up a reputation for service through his many years of work and research and teaching in the state of Kerala. So I like to think that Dr. Gulati, if he were here, would be appreciative of the emphasis on development and growth that we have tried to work on in this book and in the rest of my academic productions. I also want to thank Dr. Joseph. Again, I loved the conversation at lunch. I am so impressed with not just
This is the lunch.
what did I say?
That's okay.
Yeah. Right. So the amount of work he has done on innovation and product development, and also his efforts in building up this institution to where it is today. So it's a real honor. I would now bring up my PowerPoint slides and also share my screen for those who are online. I believe there are a few people online as well. All right, so this is about our recent book called Making Policy for the New Information Economy. I would want to start by describing the book a little bit and talking about how it came about, and then launch into a discussion of one of the cases from the book. So, is this working? Oh, I can maybe use this. Oh, it's not okay. Okay. Okay, maybe this will work now. Okay, thank you, thank you. All right, so this is a book that that had a sort of evolution over many years. This picture right here is my co-author and me. My co-author is Dr. Chun Lu, who is currently at the University of Electronic Science and Technology of China. He is a former student. When he was at Penn State in the early 2000s, he and I did some work together, but we really started collaborating only after he returned to China. And the sort of work that we did together benefited from our work experience, both our work experience over the past many years. As Dr. Joseph mentioned, I began my career as a bureaucrat in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting in India, where I used to work on media policy. And by a coincidence, Chun also had significant experience in the regulatory and industrial environment for telecommunications in China. He worked for the Sichuan province telecom regulator, as well as for China Telecom. So we were pooling our experience both in government and in industry and in academia in doing these papers together. So one of the first papers that we worked on, wait, okay. Wait. This one?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the first papers we worked on was looking at the case from India called the conditional access system. And in China, we were talking about IPTV. This was basically using technological devices as intermediaries between the consumer and the service provider. So in India, there was a long controversial case involving the conditional access system that eventually resulted in the transition from the Ministry of Information Broadcasting regulating it to try coming in and doing some of the price regulation and so on. Similarly, for IPTV in China as well, there was a transition from the telecom, the film and television regulator to a technology regulator. So we were talking about how when confronted with certain very controversial policy questions, the system itself can be modified in response to the challenge from the regulatory issue. So we did this paper, and then we did another paper comparing the broadband plans in the two countries. This was basically trying to deploy high-speed broadband networks in both the countries. These two countries face similar challenges, and the responses were also similar in some respects, but dramatically different in other respects. So what we did in this paper was look at how these two countries had deployed broadband networks. We did a third paper together in which we were looking at universal service. Universal service is this idea that all people in society have to have access to information and communication technologies in order to find a job, get an education, participate in society, and so on. So we looked at how the universal service systems in the two countries worked, and we came to certain conclusions there. Finally, we did a paper on how the two countries set mobile standards. Now, at this time, when we were writing, the technology generation we were concerned about was 3G. So we looked at how China and India set the standards for 3G mobile communications. Now, of course, after that, the industry has moved on and we have got 4G and 5G, and now we are talking about 6G. But at this time, what we were talking about in this paper was exclusively about 3G. So once we had done these 4 papers together, we sort of felt that we have enough material and we have got enough insight into the way the policymaking systems work in these two countries that we can put it together into a book. And that is what eventually came out. So this was published last year, and it represents a lot of work that went into these papers. And of course, we couldn't stop with these papers because by the time we were writing the book, the industry has moved on, and we had to update all these case studies in order to write the book. So the book is completely brand new. Everything in the papers was completely rewritten. Now, for this audience here, I don't have to use this slide at all. This is the slide I use when I'm doing a book talk in the United States. This is the slide I use. But here, I don't have to use it. But let me just go through it really quickly. Basically, it's a comparison of China and India to justify why comparing these two countries makes sense. Why should we be comparing China and India? Obviously, the two countries have got similar population. China is much larger. It has got about 3 times the land area. But if you look at the population density, it is about the same because the western 2/3 of the country are basically uninhabitable. So you're talking about 1/3 of the country close to the coast that has got most of the population. And in terms of some of this data is already outdated. For example, there is the GDP comparison. China is much higher right now, and India also. It's 2.8, but it is now possibly 3.7. 3.8 trillion dollars. The per capita GDP has changed, the annual growth rate has changed. And of course, I'm hoping that when the 2021 postponed census is finally conducted, we would see that the poverty rate in India has come down significantly as well. But I don't have to dive deep into this slide here because we are basically saying that China and India are worthy of comparison. And the other reason is that they have got very different political systems. We have got an authoritarian one-party government in China and multi-party democracy in India. And that's why there has been a lot. There's a virtual cottage industry of books, dozens of books that have been written comparing these two countries. Because of that obvious similarity in economic and demographic characteristics and the difference in political systems. So now getting into the book a little bit, this is the chapter structure. We introduce the book in the first chapter, and then we theorize the policy process. So there are lots of theories about how policy works, how policy making functions in a society. And we review those theories because we want to base our analysis on that theoretical framework. For example, we talked about the economic theory of regulation, the public interest theory. We talked about punctuated equilibrium and the heuristics model and things like that in that chapter. Now, the third chapter is also very important. Basically, this is a comparison of state and society. What do we mean by that? We talk about the historical, cultural, civilizational antecedents of these two countries. Because one of the things that we believe is that some of these elements from the deep historical memory of a society influence how we make policy today, how interest groups interact, how a society functions is based upon these deep historical roots. So we talk about that. We also talk about the political systems, how the political systems work in the two countries. Now, in China, it's very unique. And some of that was new information for me as well as we were writing this chapter. Of course, I had the help of my colleague to help me work through some of those intricacies. China has got basically two governments. It is not just one government. There are two governments. One is the formal administrative government, which is comprised of bureaucrats and political appointees. But on the other side, there is the party government, which is a parallel bureaucracy. Every office in China is headed by not one person, but two people. For example, an institute like this would not just have Professor Joseph, but there would be a political appointee who would lead the institution as well.
We also have all of them are like that.
Yeah. Right. So every place in China has got two leaders, and it works in a very different way. And we have to understand that in order to make sense of how policy works in the two countries. Now, after we set the foundation for our analysis with these three chapters, we get into the case studies. Now, what we did, I'll explain how we did the case studies in a minute, but we have chapter 4, 5, 6, and 7 are essentially case studies. And we did comparative case studies. I'll describe that in a lot more detail in just the next slide. And finally, we have got chapter 8, which brings us to the conclusions. We draw some lessons from the comparison. And our hope, as I was talking about earlier, with reference to Dr. Gulati's work, is that we are able to help the development process in the two countries. That's our ultimate goal. Now, to get into the case selection, this is the heart. This is the basic work that we did in this book. We have got 4 chapters of case studies, and there is a lot of literature on case selection. How do you choose cases? Now, see, let me backtrack a bit. Case selection, a case study requires careful selection. Why is a case interesting? Why should you be looking at a particular case? Now, that requires explanation. And based upon how you choose those case studies, you can come to very different conclusions. So it is important to explain how case selection needs to be done. And what we had was paired comparisons. What we did was from every one of our, for every one of our chapters, we essentially have 2 case studies, one of which is drawn from China and the other from India. Now, we used 2 dimensions for our cases. The first dimension is what we call homogeneity or heterogeneity of decision makers. Now, there is an enormous literature. There's plenty of literature out there that talks about how decision groups function. So let's say that we put a group of people with similar academic backgrounds or professional backgrounds together in a room. Now, it is very easy for them to come to a decision because they agree on what analysis needs to be done. Let's say that all economists or all lawyers or all technologists, all engineers getting together in a room are able to agree very quickly on what are the important points, what are the important factors in a decision. Now, secondly, they also employ similar tools. So let's say that we are talking to a group of economists, they would say, do a cost benefit analysis, right? if you talk to a technologist, they would say they would come up with a completely different evaluation method. So if a group is homogeneous, you come to a decision very quickly. Now, but that may not be the best decision. That is because homogeneous groups are likely to have what is called groupthink, because they think that they know all the parameters, they know all the variables that are important. They will very quickly come to a decision, but it will not be a solution potentially outside the box. Now, at the same time, if you've got heterogeneous groups where there are a variety of participants, not just economists or lawyers, but also community leaders, consumer advocates, politicians, technocrats, and so on, they would come to decisions very slowly. They might have not even agreement on the basic parameters of the decision, but ultimately they would come to a better decision because they've got more solutions on the table, right? Because they're able to think through many different possibilities for that problem. So that is one dimension that we used in choosing the cases, homogeneous versus heterogeneous groups. Now, on the second dimension, we used time horizon. Now, again, there is plenty of literature in game theory that talks about single shot versus iterative decision making. In single shot decision making, two parties are interacting only once. Now, they know that this is the only opportunity you have of benefiting from this interaction. So, what would you try to do? You would try to get the maximum possible from that interaction. But at the same time, if you've got iterative decision making, let's say that you're asking two people to negotiate a solution repeatedly over time. In the first round, you might think, well, there are lots more interactions coming down, right? Now, if I am shown to be more flexible, accommodative, generous in the first round, maybe my partner will reciprocate in future rounds. So it is possible to have a different decision dynamic work when you've got single shot decisions versus iterative decision making. Now, let me confess, right? Because this time dimension that we try to incorporate into our case selection did not work really well. And I'll present a case study where what we thought was single shot decision making became iterative. And I'll talk about the consequences of that, right? So that's another thing that happens in case study research, that sometimes after you go through the process, after you employ the method, you realize that there are additional lessons to be learned from the process itself. And I'll talk about that. So that was our second dimension. So it's a 2x2 matrix that we were using for this analysis. So here's the 2x2 matrix, okay? So on one dimension, I mentioned homogeneous and heterogeneous decision makers, and that is what you see on the two columns. These are interest groups. Are they comprised of professionals all drawn from the same background, or is it multidisciplinary teams? That is the second dimension. That's the second criterion. Now, on the second dimension, we have got short-term decision making versus long-term decisions. And we have got a classification here. Short-term homogeneous, we chose 3G standard setting. Short-term heterogeneous, we had two cases actually, two situations actually. We used addressable cable IPTV as our first comparison. And then we looked at OTT, over-the-top television and over-the-top communication services in the two countries as a second paired comparison. So that chapter, chapter 5, actually has, it's a very long chapter, and that has got 4 case studies actually. And in the other columns, we have other cells, we have got long-term homogeneous decision-making, that's the National Broadband Plan, and heterogeneous long-term decision-making would be universal service. So that's the case study structure that we had in the book. Now, I want to talk, obviously, I'm not going to talk about 10 different case studies here. You would be bored to tears. So I'm going to talk about only one comparison, one of our chapters, which is the case of mobile standard setting 3G to 5G. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our original paper on which this chapter was based was only 3G, but eventually we expanded it to 3G, 4G, and 5G. Now, I will talk about the Chinese case first and then go to India strictly by alphabetical order, not because China is more important than India, right? I'll just by alphabetical order, C and then I. If we change our name to Bharat, then it'll be first. All right, now China, mobile standards. So what was going on in China in the area of mobile standards from the time it was introduced? Now, China's mobile developments started with 3G in the early 1990s. I'm sorry, 2G in the early 1990s. There were three standards that were introduced simultaneously in China. There is a little bit of politics there as well. GSM and CDMA are no-brainers, obvious choices because these are the dominant international standards. And so China was using GSM and CDMA as the two standards. So where did this third one come from? PHS, right? PHS is personal handy phone. Now, China, as I'll explain later, has got the system of managed competition where the Chinese government always tries to either encourage or hamstring one of the competitors in order to restore a level playing field. They don't want any player to get really big. So if they find that one of the companies is getting too big, what they do is they disadvantage it in some respects so that it is cut down to size. For example, they might take a territory away from them, or they might take a business line away from them, or they might put some new obligations on them just to make it harder for them to compete. So it's like if you're running a race and there is someone who is ahead by 10 meters, you would put weights around their feet. That's what China does. And in this case, GSM and CDMA, which were the dominant international standards, were assigned to China Mobile and China Unicom. Now, what about China Telecom? At this time, China Telecom was the dominant provider, the controller of all wireline networks in China. Now, China Telecom was not awarded a mobile license at all. Now, China Telecom was very upset about it. They went to the government and said, what about us? Why are we not given a mobile? Because this is an attractive new business line. They did not want to be left out of that opportunity. So they went to the Chinese government and said, what about us? So that is when China introduced something called the personal handy phone. It is basically a wireless phone that is only capable of communicating within a short distance. Now, it is basically, you can think about it as an extension of your home wireline phone with a wireless device. So it could not communicate beyond a few hundred meters. So in a smaller town, that was enough. If you're living in the village and China Telecom wanted to deploy a PHS system there, they are free to. But the largest cities and the nation as a whole was GSM and CDMA with China Mobile and China Unicom. So that was 2G. Now, as soon as they started introducing 3G, 3G's trial started in 1995, 98. And again, that's an interesting story right there because China at this stage was basically just coming off their liberalization. Their liberalization started in 1979. The 80s was an experimental period, but in the 90s, they were really beginning to implement some of those industrial policies. So at this time, they were very interested in attracting international capital and technology. So everything that they did in this stage was not basically to set the standard, but basically to get investment to come in and technologies to come in. So it was all about technology transfer. So Shinwei was a company that they set up. CAT is I forget the abbreviation now, but it's in the book. It was basically a research lab belonging to the Ministry of MPT, the Ministry of Post and Telecommunications. Seville was an Austin, Texas-based technology company with which CAT tied up, and eventually they brought in Siemens as well. So the goal was that there would be an effort to build a domestic Chinese standard, which would result in the transfer of technology and new jobs being created, new investments, new factories coming in based upon this new standard that they would develop. 3 years later, they got the TD-SCDMA standard accepted by the ITU and 3GPP. So it was an international standard in competition with GSM and CDMA. Now, you can imagine that it did not get a lot of traction because they were going up against these dominant standards that were already cornering the international market. And now there was this upstart Chinese standard that was trying to make inroads into that market. Obviously, China did not succeed. China did a lot, all that it could. Spectrum allocations, all that was done. And in the telecom restructuring, they tried their best to support TD-SCDMA. By this time, China Mobile had become the dominant provider, and they assigned China Mobile the responsibility of supporting the TD-SCDMA standard. But after about almost 2 decades of work on the standard had failed. No other country had picked up the TD-SCDMA standard, and no one else had taken it up. Even in China, despite all the efforts of the Chinese government, TD-SCDMA penetration peaked at about 20%. That means 80% or 4 out of Chinese consumers were not using the domestic standard. So it was a failure. Now, there is literature, there are scholars who say that it was a failed success or a successful failure. Now, why do they say that? It is basically because the experience with TD-SCDMA allowed China to build on the next generation. So when the next generation came in, by the way, not the next generation, they bypassed the generation and the one after that. Now, what happened with 4G? 4G in China was essentially a sandwich generation. No one paid it much attention, right? Look at the timeline here. The timeline was up until 2012, China was trying to build the TD-SCDMA. Okay. Now, we will see very soon that 5G trials started up as soon as the effort to build up TD-SCDMA ended. So basically, there was no attention paid to 4G. There was some noise made that LTE TDD was a domestic standard, but it's really not, because all it was doing was it was taking the international standard and using some domestically developed air interfaces. That was it. But there was a lot of hype about LTE TDD. There was a lot of domestic media claiming that, oh, China is now setting the international standard. Not true. It is basically a bypassed generation. Now comes the interesting part. 5G. Now, look at the timeline here. I said earlier that 2012, up until 2012, China was trying to push the 3G standard, the domestically developed 3G standard. But in 2013, they were trying already for 5G. They had bypassed the generation, and they had started their effort for 5G in 2013. Now, they had learned their lesson. They were no longer trying to develop a domestic standard. They gave that up. They knew that the same thing would happen. Just using the installed base in China, you cannot expand to the rest of the world. It is not possible. So what did they do? If you cannot beat them, what do? You join them. So at this stage, China had already started cooperating with other standard setting bodies around the world. So very early, very, very early, as soon as 5G trials were starting up in the rest of the world, China had started participating in IMT 2020. This is a global effort, many participants, many technology companies participating in this effort, and China started participating right from the beginning. They were very proactive for 5G spectrum allocation and auctions. They learned from that mistake too. In 3G, the mistake that happened was that after the standard was developed, it took a long time for the spectrum to be allocated. So there was no rollout of the standard, even when the standard was available. China avoided that mistake. as soon as the standard was developed, they were already starting field trials. And today, what do you see? China is dominating the global 5G standard. By one estimation, this is from a consulting company called IPlytics. Compiles all the patterns as that are parts of multiple mobile generations. And by one estimate, they have a third of 5G patterns. Chinese companies, mostly Huawei and ZTE, control about a third of all 5G standard essential patterns. They control about 76% of global handset sales. Now, that is a dramatic success. Now, what does it do? It brings in jobs into China. It brings in investments into China, right? So from the failed success of 3G, we go to the outstanding successful success in 5G. Now let's take a look at what's happening in India in this time. So in India, we have 2G trials starting at about the same time as in China, a couple of years later, but not much different. In early 90s in China and 94, 95 in India. India had only two standards accepted at this time, GSM and CDMA. Same thing, the PHS was not there, but that's minor. That's not a major issue. GSM and CDMA was introduced in India as well. Now let's see what happens with 3G. When 3G was introduced, the Indian telecom regulators primarily accepted two standards, WCDMA and CDMA 2000, which provided evolution paths for those carriers that have adopted GSM or CDMA. Was there a third proposal ever? No. If you look at all the documents during this time from the Ministry, the Department of Information Technology, from the Ministry of Electronics, from TROI, you see no single reference to starting up a domestic standard. There was no thought about it at all, no reference to it at all. The discussion was always about which international standard to adopt. So 3G was deployed in India with around this time, 2006 to 2012. There was a little bit of a, I'm joking. There was a little bit of a setback with the 2G auctions and that entire scandal that happened during that time. So that set the telecom sector back a little bit as well. But 4G trials were delayed in India. If you compare the timeline in the two countries, the deployment of 4G was delayed. The growth of the network was also delayed in India, 1% in 2015, 22% in 2000. Oh, I think I might have a typo here. This must have been an earlier date, and 77% by 2021 was 4G. What about 5G? 5G trials are starting up just now. We are way behind. So with every succeeding generation, we have fallen further and further behind China. That is what we see. 5G penetration is 11%. That's one report that I saw, but you people might know this better, that many of those 5G phones are 5G format, but they are not equipped to receive, they're not receiving 5G service yet, right? So, but that is what the data say, that 11% of phones in India are 5G. So the question becomes, and this is where that comparison that I presented earlier comes into play. China and India are pretty similar in a lot of respects. We have got similar population density in the populated parts. We have got similar population. China is ahead much more in economic terms, but we are catching up. And there are lots of metrics that look similar. So why did China and India adopt such dramatically different strategies for mobile standard setting? What do we see here? What does the record say? In 3G, in indigenous standard, developed and it failed. In 4G, stage was basically bypassed, and in 5G, an early start and dominance in the outcome. Okay, now in India's case, consistently chose the international standard. Why is that? That is the question we ask in this chapter, right? Now, we have a few explanations. We have got a few answers for this question, why, and I want to go through all of them. And of course, I would love to hear your feedback for our future work. So here are some explanations. First of all, it seems from the information on this slide that China has succeeded tremendously in setting a standard and India has failed. I would like to defend my country, right? I would say that it is not really a failure. It depends on what criteria you're using to evaluate the two experiences. Let me explain. Standards choices have costs and benefits, right? Now, the political problem, of course, is that the costs and benefits are not allocated to the same individuals or the same groups. Some groups benefit and some groups are asked to pay the price. So there's a political trade-off here, and the trade-off is this, right? When you choose an international standard, what happens? You're basically benefiting from the R&D investments undertaken by others. You've got, I mean, there's a lot of expenditure involved in developing a standard, developing the test beds and running the tests. And eventually you fix all the bugs and then you have the benefit of transferring the technology to a third party. So lower R&D expenses, lower costs because of economies of scale. Why is that? Because if you're using CDMA equipment or GSM equipment, which is adopted in 100 countries across the world, those costs of development, those fixed costs have been amortized over a large scale of output. So the average cost of these technologies, this equipment is much lower than if you were to develop your own indigenous standard. Now, China and India are both very big countries, but they are still not the same size as the global market. So any economies of scale that exist in India and China are not as big as the economies of scale that would prevail in a global market, which is what the international standards have. So lower risk, because again, China's experience, right? They developed the TD-SCMS standard and then they found there were no takers. No one was willing to pick it up. So what happens then? There is a huge risk. There is a business risk in investing in technology because the output may not be what you expect, right? So lower risk and greater network externalities. Again, if you've got a dominant standard, it is likely that there would be a lot of manufacturers, lot of software producers that would be producing goods and services that fit with your network, right? For example, handset makers, right? There would be more CDMA handset makers than TD-SCMA standards handset makers. So those benefits also come to providers with greater network externalities. Now, on the downside, right? So there are costs and benefits, right? On the downside, if you're adopting an international standard, you actually end up paying a lot in license fees, right? You cannot get around that fact, right? So you're paying more in license fees, and there is no opportunity to build up national innovation capabilities. China's goal was always that to start up their domestic manufacturing industries as well as to help their R&D establishment. India did not do that, right? So those opportunities were lost to India as well. So positive and negative benefit. There are benefits and costs attached with any sort of choice. So essentially what we see is that in China, they were handicapping their equipment, their equipment users, which are the networks, and the consumer in order to help the manufacturers. India did almost exactly the opposite. India helped consumers and service providers while putting a burden on the manufacturers, right? Just anecdotal. This is not proof. right? This is not proof, but just anecdotally, let's take a look at the cost of 1 GB of mobile data in these countries. India has got among the lowest cost for 1 GB of mobile data in the world. We have got rank 7, 16 cents for 1 GB of data. Okay. China is much higher. China has the benefit of economies of scale as well. Their costs need to be comparable to India's, but it's more than 2.5 times more. Not 2.5, 2.2 times more. The world median cost for 1 GB of mobile data is about $1.18. The US is a scandal, right? The US is a scandal because I live in the US, I pay $6 for 1 GB of data, which is many, many times what we pay in India. So India, because of the way the telecom industry has developed, the level of competition here, the choices that were made has got much more benefit for the consumer. Lower priced handsets, lower cost of service, lower cost for data than practically any other market in the world. Where have we lost? We have lost that opportunity of having a domestic electronics manufacturing sector because of these choices, right? So I would say that though the comparison seems to suggest that China has won the standards race and India has lost, that comparison is unfair to India. And we have some reasons to say that some of the choices we have made are pro-consumer and pro-service provider, even though we lost out on the manufacturing opportunity. So that's one argument. The second argument is that because of the sort of system that China has, they've got these companies that are ministerial champions. Now, this is a term that we developed in this book. So if you're going to cite anything, please do. Ministerial champions, I'll explain what ministerial champions are. Okay. Now, there is a lot of literature on what are called national champions. This goes back all the way to the 1950s. In the post-World War II period, there were countries like Japan and Korea that started to build up their domestic manufacturing conglomerates to be international competitors. How did they do that? They would give government contracting to them. They would give subsidies to them, export subsidies. They would channel R&D money to them, all sorts of benefits and restriction of competition to them domestically. So they wouldn't allow other companies to come in and compete with the national champion. So we have got companies like Sony and Toyota and Samsung that became global giants because they started from protected domestic markets. And that's the concept of national champions. By the way, some of the seminal work in this area was done by Jeffrey Hart, who is one of my professors that I worked with at Indiana University. He was one of the people who came up with this idea of national champions. So dominant domestic firms able to extend their power internationally because they have got the government supporting them domestically. This is the national champion. Now, what is a ministerial champion then? Now, China has got a very unique market. In China, every asset is owned by the state because it is a communist system. But at the same time, there is intense competition, right? There is a lot of competition in China. So what happens? The competition is essentially between state-owned enterprises. Now, who are these state-owned enterprises affiliated with? They are affiliated with various ministries. They are the babies of ministries. And just like a parent would care for a baby, the ministries look after the interests of the ministerial champion. It is the same concept of the national champion extended to the private sector enterprise, the public enterprises that ministries control, right? There are numerous examples of this. China Telecom was essentially the creation of the Ministry of Post and Telecommunications. We have got the China Broadcasting Corporation, which is essentially a creation of an organization called SARFT. SARFT is the state authority for the regulation of radio, television, and film. And they control the China Broadcasting Corporation. China Netcom was started by the railways. Now, China Unicom was started by the Ministry of Electronics and Electronics Industries. Now, there are these ministries would set up these companies in order to extend their power, right? Now, what does the ministry get out of it? The ministry basically gets a piggy bank. So what they do is, anytime the ministry has a priority, right, some sort of policy that they want to accomplish, they would go to their ministerial champion and they would say, this is your job. Now you do this. You take whatever profits you get and invest it in this priority. And they oblige. Chinese companies oblige because they have no choice. Now, in the case studies that we did, some in Chinese, the Chinese language, which my co-author was able to read and use, we found that China Mobile did not want to take leadership on CDM, on TD-SCMA. They did not want, they thought it was a burden, but they did it because they have no choice. What is the choice? If they refuse, next day, they take a train to Xinjiang. Xinjiang is like the remote Western province. So what we have is ministerial champions where the ministry offers protection in return for the company providing all these resources and managerial expertise to the ministry. So here's the relationship graphically shown, right? So the ministry provides policy support and protection, and the ministerial champion, the public company, the public enterprise that provides resources and policy implementation help for the ministry. Okay. Now, in the case of China's mobile standards, this dynamic was in evidence again and again, not just in 3G, but repeatedly when these enterprises were asked to take their excess profit and channel it towards either deploying a technology or doing R&D on that technology. How was China able to do this? Because of their unique domestic economic structure. Would we be able to go to Reliance Jio and ask them, say, take 10 crore rupees and put that into development of R&D? They would say, sorry, I mean, we have got other priorities, right? They would not do it, right? So that is one of the challenges that we face when we are dealing with a privatized telecom sector. All right. So the role of managed competition, right? Now, the other thing that China has very successfully done was always maintain parity between service providers. Now, you know this better than I do, right? Because you lived through that experience of intense telecom competition. Now, if you go back, I know you're all very young, so I don't know if you remember that personally, but maybe you have read about it. What happened when Reliance Jio came into the market? We were talking about it at lunch. When Reliance Jio came into the market, they basically cut the prices of voice service to zero. Now, and then what did they do? They said they were upselling data service to consumers. Now, what happens when one provider comes in, and this is a very well-financed company, they come in and cut the prices to zero. What happens to the other providers? They have to follow, right? Now, when an entire industry cuts prices, what happens to the margins? Margins evaporate, they disappear. Now, once the margins disappear, there is absolutely no money for R&D. So it's essentially destructive competition. At one time, we tracked the number of service providers in our book. There were 17 telecom companies in India, all of them intensely competitive. And when that happens, what happens to margins? They evaporate, they disappear. No one makes a profit. It is basically destructive competition, not the Schumpeterian variety, but it is still destructive competition. Okay, now what happens in China? They work with an oligopoly. And when any one player gets too big, what do? Like I mentioned earlier, there's a running race. One of the runners is ahead by 10 feet or 10 meters. What do? You stop them and you put a weight around their feet. China does this repeatedly. Here's a graph. Let me go to the graph, right? So what do? Oh, I'm sorry. Right. So they use a lot of techniques to do this. For example, if one of the players is weaker, what do? They allocate prime spectrum to them. Or they say that now you are the weakest player. See, this is the reverse of market logic, right? What happens in markets? In markets, it is exactly the opposite that happens. The weakest players they fall further and further behind, and then they are eliminated from the market. They declare bankruptcy and exit the market. But in a managed competition, what happens? The weakest players get access to the best resources. It's the smallest, like, it's the smallest kid in the family that gets the paisam, right? So that is exactly what happens in China. The smallest kid is always given the paisam, right? So this is a graph, right? So China Telecom, I'm sorry, maybe you're not able to read that very well, but I can explain it to you. So China Telecom was started up by the MPT in 1949, right after their communist revolution. China Unicom came in later, again created by the Ministry of Electronic Industries. It was their ministerial champion when competition began to intensify and China Unicom began to fall behind. China Unicom was the little kid at this time. What did they do? They split up China Telecom. They said, China Telecom, you've grown too big. China Unicom, you're too small. We'll level the playing field for you by splitting up China Telecom. So their mobile properties, which at this time were just starting up, were allocated to China Mobile. We know that story too, because what did they do? At this point, they gave GSM to China Mobile and gave nothing to China Telecom other than PHS, right? And China Satcom was a satellite communication company. They separated that also from China Telecom, and China Telecom just became the wireline provider. What did they do? So essentially, this is exactly what happened. China Telecom was getting too far ahead. They pulled it back and they tied weights around its feet. Now, a few years later, China Titong started up. It was provided by the railways. It was not doing very well, so they merged it with China Mobile in 2008. China Satcom was not doing very well too. What did they do? They took all their basic telephony operations, satellite telephony operations, and gave it to China Telecom. And they again restructured the industry in 2008 to make three dominant telecom providers. It became an equal oligopoly. Now, repeatedly, China does this. Repeatedly, China intervenes in markets to level the playing field. If anyone is growing big, it's like just like saying, Reliance Jio is growing too big. We are going to take Mumbai away from you, and we are going to give it to Vodafone, right? Now, that cannot happen in India, but in China, they do it very successfully. So, role of managed competition, right? I did not talk about what is the consequence of that, right? What is the consequence of managed competition? When there are oligopolistic markets, all of them make reasonable profits. And those profits are available to their ministries to deploy for their policy priorities. Okay, so that's the role of managed competition. Now, the last sad story, again, we talked about Dr. Joseph is the expert on that. So I'll defer to him for input, but he's the expert on this, right? Now, some of our past policy choices also limited our options. What are these past policy choices? Prior to liberalization, if you're going back to the 1970s and you look at the number of patents issued in the telecom sector to China and India, you would see that they're about the same. No difference. In fact, you can even see, in fact, your colleague Sunil Mani has compiled some of that data and written about it. Um, some of those statistics show that India was actually getting more telecom patents than China was at this time. India had a very strong R&D sector, had a very strong, not in general, but in telecom, had a strong R&D structure. What happened to it? Now, what happened was in the 1980s, we had destructive deregulation. We basically threw everything out. We destroyed our manufacturing capability. We destroyed our telecom research labs. We were talking about CDOT and CDAC and all these research establishments that were basically gutted. The soul was sucked out of them, like the Dementors did to Harry Potter, right? No, this is not a Harry Potter audience. Um, there are some people who are Harry Potter audiences. Okay. So what we did was we destroyed our manufacturing capability. So now when we come to the 2000s, and then China is working with these opportunities of using the standard setting process to support their manufacturing industries, we find there is no manufacturing industry to support. So even if we did standard setting, what is the next step? The next step would be to start up manufacturing based upon that standard. And it is that manufacturing that will create the jobs, that will justify the investments in R&D for standards. Now, if you don't have that downstream game plan, there is absolutely no point in setting standards. You might as well benefit from the economies of scale in international standards, right? So that's exactly what happened in India. So I want to start with a few. How am I doing on time? Yeah, 4:40. So have I gone over time? It's fine. Okay. My apologies. I get carried away when I'm talking about these things. But I'll do this very quickly. First of all, I want to talk about policy learning. Remember when I talked about iterative versus single shot decision making? And we looked at these cases as single shot decision making because every time you want to set a standard, it's essentially a one time deal. You're setting the standard and moving on. But no, that is not really the case because in mobile standards, there are multiple generations. So when we looked at it first in our paper, when we were only looking at 3G standards, it was single shot. But when we were looking at multiple generations, as we did in the book, it became iterative standard setting. Now, that raises the opportunity for what is called policy learning. Now, we learn from experience, right? Whenever we go through any experience, we learn from it what to do, what not to do the next time. But do states learn? Do governments learn? The evidence is much weaker on that, right? Because in some ways, if you look at government, we think that, oh, the New Delhi government or the government in Trivandrum, something like that, right? You think that it is one entity. It is just one organization. But in reality, there is nothing called government separate from the people who man specific posts in government, right? And there is a lot of change there, especially in a system like India, where the Indian Administrative Service has got all the top positions, all the secretaries, and so on. And there is rapid change over there. No one stays in one position for more than a few years. You might be doing fisheries today, and tomorrow you're doing small business, or the next day you're doing education. You don't have the opportunity to develop expertise there. But in China, it is very different. Remember ministerial champions? Because there is close symbiosis between the ministry and the industry that is regulated by it, there is a lot of feedback loops. the same personnel circulate back and forth between industry and government. And because of that, there is a lot more opportunity for what is called policy learning. It is the same group of people who are going out to industry, coming back 5 years later with the added perspective of having worked in industry. That doesn't happen in India. IAS officers are not sent out to work at Reliance Geo and they don't come back with the experience of having worked in industry. Reliance Geo executives are not hired to work in the Ministry of Information Technology, right? So that doesn't happen in India, but it happens very well in China. That is why there is opportunity for policy learning. Number two, policy involves trade-offs. We talked about that. So in the interest of time, I'll just bypass that. And I'll also talk about how we talk in the book about how policy choices in the past condition our present options. Again, with apologies for having gone over time and still hoping that Kiran will let me have some time for questions, I would say thank you.
Professor Jayakar, this is really a magnificent journey, I must say. And I only complaint that I have is that you have not shown the trick of an author and an editor of a journal. You should not have told the complete story. I think there should be something left for us to read the book. You have not done that. That's, I think you are not a your marketing sense is not very good, I think. It's really, really good, I must say. It's, I really enjoyed. And I don't know. I'm not going to ask any question, whatever it is. But I know we have someone to initiate the discussion. Dr. Pradeep will do that. But to say the least, it was an excellent exposition of the situation in both countries, and the policy learning of the type that you proposed is eminently useful. But we have got, I mean, we can talk at length about that. If you replicate these things in India, things will go wayward, because that's another problem. Because I think Chinese, they know how to discipline themselves. In fact, anyway, but we are sometimes if you replicate those things with Indian context, the outcome may be terrible, perhaps. But I think our this. I think I'll stop here, because your ministerial champions, right? It's a very interesting term that you have coined. Is very, and the destructive competition which India is following. On the other hand, the manner in which they promote a competitive environment, and even the automobile industry, the way in which they promoted FDI is very differently from the way we opened up to foreign companies. I mean, there is a lot that we need to learn by way of the managed competition. I think very interesting and illuminating and highly educative. Thank you very much. And I will leave to Dr. Pradeep to start the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Joseph, and thank you, Professor Jacob, for the presentation. It actually reflected your involvement and passion towards what you've done towards the book. That was very, in fact, I never realized that it's time, it is 4:40. And a lot of new insights on, as mentioned, on what you call managed competition and champions. Yes, it is always interesting to look at both India and China, and it is often done. But I don't know whether we are comparing apples and oranges. Something which needs to be, again, a lot of insights and a lot of pointers for further studies and deliberations, etc. And now I will open the forum for questions, discussions, comments.
What came to my mind is about Chindia. Jairam Ramesh's book on Chindia. No complaint between India and he also started with China first.
Yes.
No. Okay, the floor is open. Right.
Yep.
Hello. Thank you, Professor Jagar. It was very interesting to hear from you the long saga of 3G to 5G. But I would like to know from you, if you're looking the current context, you can see how the geopolitics is playing a big role in determining the technology that has to be grown. For example, the case of Huawei versus
Yep.
the US. So I just want to know whether the geopolitical compulsions were a part of the Chinese um, pressure to develop technology. Vis-a-vis the Indian case, it was the geopolitical thing of having FDI, the openness to FDI. So maybe a quick look into
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and there are several ways that geopolitics influenced this dynamic that we presented in the paper. First of all is the China's negotiation to become part of WTO. They were making a lot of concessions during this time in order to become part of WTO. So the greater openness to international investments and trade and better protection for intellectual property, all of that came about because of China's drive to join WTO. So that's one geopolitical angle. The second geopolitical angle was that they wanted to attract international technology companies to come in as well. So it was part of like geoeconomics, geopolitics. That dimension is also very important. In this time, China was basically a technology recipient. They had not ramped up their investments in things like artificial intelligence and 5G networks and things like that, or robotics. They are becoming powers in these areas. At that time, China was still the technology recipient, and they were basically managing their policy in a way that will attract international technology companies to come in. Now, the third geopolitical angle is not specific to China, but to the rest of the world. Again, we were talking about this at lunch, and there was from the time of Ronald Reagan in the U.S., there was a sort of geopolitical thinking that said if China could be integrated better into the global economy, maybe they would be weaned away from Russia and also become a more responsible global power. So in order to get China more integrated into the global economy, all the Western powers, especially the United States, liberalized their import regimes. So there was a lot of manufactured goods flowing into the Western nations, including the US, basically as a way of tying China to the rest of the world. Now, one of the problems that we will face with India trying to make in India, right, that big push towards make in India, is that that geopolitical window has closed. There is no imperative of trying to tie in these major and emerging powers into the global system using trade and economic opportunity as the attractant. So that window is closed. So India has to find another way of trying to export or trying to grow the economy without exports. So excellent question. And definitely there is a geopolitical angle.
Good afternoon, Professor. Again, in continuation to what he asked, after the Huawei fiasco, they ended up developing something parallel to the Google Play Store.
Yeah.
And again, in the now they are you are talking about 5G, maybe 6G or 7G. So historically, I mean, we can see that China has been always an inward-looking society, right from the Great Wall. So maybe when the next they are setting up, going for the next standard, will they try to say develop something domestically because of again the ongoing geopolitical dynamics and
Yep.
especially if Trump is back in US, you
Yep.
don't know. I mean, what may happen. So what they may do, I mean, this is a thing that I've been thinking because if they are going to develop things on their own, they may lose. I mean, they are hold on the manufacturing scenario. So what I mean, will they follow the same policy or they'll go back to the domestic standard development what they were doing in the early 2000s? What's your take on?
Yeah. I don't think they would their preferred solution is not to develop a domestic standard or a domestic, like, like an operating system or a mobile standard. Their preference is to influence and have dominance over the international standard. And in some cases, for example, electric vehicles, they are succeeding. But because of geopolitics, if they are denied a particular technology as a second best option, plan B, they might develop a domestic standard. They might develop a domestic variant. But their preferred solution right now, we are not talking about the China of the 1990s anymore. We're talking about the China of the 2020s. And they are not the same country at all, because they built up their technological capabilities to a level where in some industries, in some key industries, they are at the cutting edge. But they, of course, it's an interconnected technology marketplace. So if they are denied, for example, high performance semiconductors, they might try to develop some of their own technologies. But if not, if they have access to international markets, the preferred solution would be to integrate. That's my thinking. Yeah.
That is what once the ambassador said, we should know how to dance with the wolves. This is the term which he used today, kind of.
Hello, sir. Thank you for your lecture, because many concepts like manage competition, it's really useful for us to think in such a way. So my simple concerns are like the prices are low in India
Yeah.
comparing to China.
Yeah.
But we have that digital divide greater than
Yeah.
China, right? So by helping consumers, they help the manufacturing.
Yeah.
That's why they created jobs and that forward and backward linkages, which
Yeah.
helped China to prosper India, right?
Mhm.
So, and we don't have a ministerial champion here.
No.
Yeah, our BSNL has gone away. So, what would be the way forward to how we can curtail this monopolistic nature of geo like things?
Yeah.
What's the way forward here? So we should invest more on manufacturing in government sector, or we have to revive the BSNL or like things.
Yeah, in some respects, I think, again, I mean, you can jump in too, because you're the experts on the market here. In some respects, that's ship, I mean, like the American expression, that ship has sailed. We have lost that opportunity. But I think we have to be proactive. We have to be forward thinking. What China does very well is they're not fighting the battle for today. They are fighting the battle for 2040. And we have to start thinking the same way. We have to start thinking, we were talking about this, that if you want to become a developed country by 2047, that's the time to make the investments in R&D is today. And we have to anticipate what the technologies of 2047 would be. And we have to start building the capacity now, starting with investments in education, investments in R&D, creating the research labs, supporting our domestic manufacturing sector, and so on, to prepare the stage for 2047. If you think that, I mean, you can win the battle for the next 5 years, we are not going to. Sorry.
No, I think I'm a bit tempted here to intervene in the sense that we have so much of policy failures to begin with. For example, when we started electronics, we wanted to have a self-reliant electronics industry, which is broad-based in consumer electronics, in professional electronics, and in electronics intermediates. And later it was said that, okay, you look at somebody from some corner said, oh, you look at South Korea, they are not doing this. Why don't you follow them? Then we kind of, with the liberalization, we want a specialization.
Mhm.
Then there came, we have a, oh, you are the super for IT super from the South. Americans started calling us IT. So we don't need to bother about manufacturing.
Mhm.
India, China is what? Blue collar labor, ours is the white collar labor. We are doing software, great. Then we got into software, then discard almost completely discarded manufacturing. And then you came with without anything, your Make in India, only talk. Make in India was nothing but a talk. Nothing has happened. And in fact, this man will tell you that the share of manufacturing has not even moved an inch forward after that, maybe 1 inch backwards. So the point is this severe policy failure, if you look at in a historical manner, the foundations of what we have created, what we have made so far, were actually made in the 50s and 60s.
Mhm.
The right from the science policy resolution to I mean, when you talk about thinking about a mini computer policy in 1965 in the after electronics conference and 71 start producing a mini computer, whatever it is. So, and the elaborate system for that, manufacture different public sector units. Now, public sector became an altogether, you want to discard public sector. BSNL was purposefully killed. I don't think that BSNL died, it's killed. It's not died. So what I'm trying to say is that today we are in a fix. In fact, with all our liking, whatever it is, and I have not changed my Airtel after 2000. 2000 I took Airtel. I still have the Airtel.
Yeah.
So I've not changed Airtel. The point I'm trying to say is that you have only Airtel is standing. This is gone. Now, the policy which you talked about China, that policy of support, creating a creative managed competition, that I don't know when we will learn. And this is what you have to, I mean, we are not against Geo, but we have personal connections, we have friends there. That's a different issue altogether. They wanted, if you're not recording, they wanted to invest in Kerala,
Yeah.
1,000 crore, but nothing happened. So it is.
Yes.
Anyway, so I think this, I mean, sometime when we look forward to, there is nothing, optimistic, this is something which, can you conclude on that kind of a note? We'll be happy to
No,
say.
no, no. I mean, I think there are lots of opportunities.
That's what
I
we
mean,
should, that should.
Yeah, for example, like, green energy. Green
Yeah.
energy is a huge opportunity where India has got a competitive advantage. We've
Yeah.
got solar,
Yeah.
wind,
That is,
geothermal.
see, that way our solar, wind guy has gone completely gone. And solar is basically backed by China. Without
Yeah.
once, if China decides our solar goes,
Yeah.
the amorphous silicon technology which they have developed, this we are running on their back. But the point which I would like to argue that somehow is it possible to think in terms of a new world order, which is different from the world order of the last century, where an enormous cost was borne by this humanity because of the unwanted competition between two superpowers.
Mm.
I am referring to USSR and USA.
Mm.
And the cost that is inflicted to the humanity, the poverty would have been much earlier abolished had that not been there. Can two superpowers, China will not agree that we are emerging as superpower. That's a different issue altogether. They won't agree. They won't consider at all, in fact. And if two big countries which are emerging as can they work together to ensure that they are no more in enmity? At least can they work together? This is what the intellectual community today should work towards. If we can think toward, if the intellectual community who are concerned about the work with China can articulate a new world order wherein India and China work together, that is going to be the best solution for the humanity. Not only for India, not only for China, for the South, for the world at large. Can we think about that? I think since you work so much with China, in fact, my Scandinavian friends are very much with it, in fact. Anyways, it will not happen, but we can always dream. But it's nothing beyond telecom policy, but this is.
Yes, I hesitate to speak to that question because it implicates lots of geopolitics
Yes,
and um, international relations, things
Yeah.
like that, on which I don't have the requisite expertise. But emotionally, I mean, I would confess I have affection for China.
Yeah.
I've been there at the last count about maybe 12, 13 times. Collectively, I've spent, I mean, every time I had a visiting appointment at the Chinese university, and every summer I would go and spend 6 weeks there. This was before the pandemic. And in the winter, I'll go back and I'll spend 2, 3 weeks more. So collectively, if you add up all the time I've spent in China, it's more than a year. I've got very good friends there. Some people who have been very kind to me. Every time I go to China, I feel very well taken care of. They have got excellent hospitality. They have,
None can beat them.
yeah, and they are very generous people. And I have a lot of affection for many elements of Chinese culture. So any sort of competition that we visualize between India and China is probably economic and maybe political, but in cultural and civilizational terms, we are kindred spirits. We have got a lot of things to be proud about, both our
In
countries.
Zhejiang, there is a huge temple.
Yeah.
What is called our Buddha temple.
Yeah.
There's nearby a big mountain.
Yeah.
They believe that it is brought from India.
In
And
fact,
Hindus are well respected, in fact, not no more.
In fact, I was just about to say, in Xi'an, in Xi'an city, there is the White Goose Pagoda, which is reputed to be the place where Huangsang went and spent 20 years translating the documents that he brought from India. And what was really emotional for me when I visited the White Goose Pagoda in Xi'an was that I lived in Benares as well. And it was from Sarnath, near Benares, that Xuanzang collected many of those documents. So I have seen both the ends of that trip. And that's a historical connection between these two countries.
I think, yeah, I think if there's any
Yeah.
question, but I want to say that if we look, I also have the same feeling.
Yeah.
I used to go, I was visiting a business person in the Tianjin University, and they gave me exemption saying that you can afford to come only for it's a full year, so I cannot come. Okay, come, and you consider even Sunday as working. They were,
Yeah.
they were so liberal that way. And in fact, I would say that Indians and Chinese, and there is enormous opportunity, I would say, between Kerala and Tamil and Kerala and China. Enormous opportunity. When when every day there is a flight between Beijing and what is called our Sri Lanka, Colombo, now but nothing to India. It's so bad. In fact, there is enormous opportunity, which anyway, that's one should be thinking about. So I think you should conclude. I think.
Any questions from the
Yeah,
online
right,
participants?
Subject.
We cannot, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I think others have left. Yeah. Okay, I think now the mic is there for formal, official out of thanks. Most important part of the seminar.
I will take 2 minutes. The honorable chair of this seminar and other respected members. Normally, in normal conditions, vote of thanks is the most welcoming part of a seminar than the welcome speech. But fortunately, because of your incredible speech, audience, they forget about time. That's good. So I want to speak 3 things on this, sir. First is content. Content-wise, I'm not saying anything. You explained well. Second is how you created that content. That is a textbook for our students and as well faculty members too. You selected a problem and put it theoretical basis and develop its context, then case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4. Then from that you develop the insights. This is a very fantastic framework that is very useful to our students too. And second is this presentation will help our students to, not only students, faculty member too, to overcome the Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger effect means it's a cognitive bias. That's people with little expertise, they will think, they will assume that I am able to take superior decisions. This overthinking will limit them. That means they don't have enough knowledge to understand that they don't have knowledge. These type of cognitive biases we can avoid by hearing this kind of presentation and speeches. That's the nicest part. And next thing is how you devoted your time for this kind of research work and bookmaking, and how you develop your thought process, how you creative you are, because this kind of intellectual journey needs many self-doubts, many self-criticisms, so all these things you have, and your passion towards this subject. Most important, beyond the publication, there are so many responsibilities, book tax, so many things. Beyond the publication, you are not taking rest. All these things are very interested factors. So on behalf of GIFT and our faculty members, I extend my sincere gratitude to you. Second is our Dr. Pradeep. I am also extending our thanks to him. And next to our director. And for the director, 2-3 things. First is his vision. His vision means he is ready to connect our students to wider academic fields. That is his vision. That's why he is always conducting these types of seminars. Always, that's kind of initiative he has taken, because they want to see that our students, they must get proper intellectual growth when they are leaving this institute. And not only that, even though we are in a public finance institute, he is every time he says that if you want to take some honey, we must know the flower, we must know the season, we must know the weather condition, all these things we must know. So this is the economy. So many economists they are there. You are talking about what information economy, how the growing economies like India and China are navigating through the information economy, and how the policy actors are navigating through the policy processes, all these things. Likewise, so many economies are there. Care economy, green economy, all these economies he is introducing to our students. For that vision, that care, and that effort, I am especially congratulating and extending my thanks to you, sir. Then to our students and faculty members, those who are online and offline, I thank to them. And last, our seminar coordinator is there. So this so much effort this seminar coordinator and his team are taking to see that this kind of seminars is continuously happening in this institute, and extending my thanks to him too and his team too. Then other people, those who are coming not to the forefront, like our technical team, Varun, Afilash, Vrunda, and Sarida, all these things, I am also extending my thanks to them, sir.
Thank
sir.
you. Have a nice evening.